All right, well, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some cover cropping work that my lab has been involved in. When I come west, especially when I talk about cover crops, I always feel compelled to tell you all what you already know, and that is Pennsylvania is not the Corn Belt, right? We farm a lot of, on a lot of topography, so conservation practices are incentivized and promoted. About 2/3 of our annual cropland acres use no-till practices. We have a fairly high rate of cover cropping adoption in the state, but this figure here from some survey work shows that there's a good kind of regional pattern to cover crop adoption where we see higher rates of adoption.
We had Steve Groff as our keynote speaker last year.
Oh, great. Yes, and so Steve would be down in that part right here where we have really high levels of cover crop adoption and struggle to integrate cover crops into our rotation elsewhere in the state. And so one other note that will come up today is that a corn soy or two crop rotation is really, based on survey data, is maybe about a quarter of our acres. So the majority of our acres are in a three crop rotation with winter wheat or integrate a perennial into the rotation because of our livestock industry. And that really shapes cover cropping windows and what we're able to do in Pennsylvania. So just keep that in mind as I kind of talk about some of the strategies that we're trying. But regardless, if advancing conservation ag is the goal and cover crops are a really important part of that, we have to be able to overcome this rotation kind of window challenge for establishing cover crops. And so after corn taken for grain or soybeans taken for grain, oftentimes we just have too limited of a growing season to consistently establish cover crops. And so we're trying to integrate cover crops to gain some ecosystem services, and some of those are related to having some continuous living cover out there or introducing some additional diversity using cover crops into our rotation, whether that be just soil erosion protection or nitrogen scavenging potential or increasing soil biological health. And if that's the challenge that we're trying to overcome, interseeding cover crops or using intercropping practices is one way to address that, and my lab is actively involved in some research on kind of weed management implications for that type of practice. I have too much I want to say about just weed suppression with cover crops, and so I don't think I'll have time to really talk about the interseeding work today. But finally, there's this recognition too that a lot of the services that we get from cover crops are biomass based, right? The more biomass we can grow, that means that we're going to build up our soil organic matter over time. We're going to see better soil aggregation or water infiltration capacity. And another benefit of more biomass from cover crops is weed suppression, okay? And so we actually know quite a bit about the influence of higher biomass cover crops and what that means from a weed suppression perspective, okay? And so this is not something new. We have a pretty good understanding of the ecology. So John Teasdale was a ARS research scientist based in the Mid-Atlantic that spent a career trying to understand weed ecology and cover crop systems. And so his takeaway from 10 or 15 years of continuing to focus on that, he had three takeaways. One, weed suppression potential with cover crops is a function of biomass, okay? That's because the more biomass we produce, either in season when it's competing with establishing weeds, results in competition for resources. If we're relying on that surface mulch in a no-till system, greater biomass influences light quantity and quality. We generally have cooler soils, oftentimes drier soils at the surface, and all those things either directly or indirectly impact weed emergence and weed survival, okay? He also found that cover cropping weed suppression potential is really species specific, so it's a better tool for small seeded species than large seeded species, and it's a better tool for broadleaf species than annual species or grass species, and it's a better tool for annuals than perennials, okay? And so this is important because in our no-till systems, we struggle with small-seeded broadleaf species. So all the talks today that have focused on weed management, we've talked about mare's tail, we've talked about water hemp and palmer. All these are small-seeded species where there is potential to use cover crops effectively to manage them. And then finally, weed suppression with cover crops is incomplete, and what John Teasdale meant by that is that we typically see really high levels or potential high levels of weed suppression early in the season, but it's not full season control that we get from cover crops. And so I think your perspective on these 3 points probably depends on where you sit, right? If you are farming and you have very limited problems when it comes to resistant weed species or weed control programs are working well, and you don't see the return on investment or perceive there to be no return on investment from cover cropping, why would you bother trying to integrate cover crops when they have kind of more limited potential as a weed control tool? Conversely, you may be struggling with multiple resistant weeds. We've heard already this morning that we're starting to see some cracks in the armor of residuals like HPPDs and our group 15s and PPOs. Those are the chemistries that currently are providing the foundation for control of those species. And if that's the case, then we actively looking for, one, other tools, and two, how do we continue to steward those types of products and keep them effective rather than seeing resistance evolve. And then third, you may be actively trying to cover crop, and so you're thinking about cover cropping for multiple services, and there's this potential to optimize or change your cover cropping strategies to really make it a better weed control tool. And it's really this last perspective that I've been focusing on, this idea that we're starting with cover crops as a basis in our cropping system, and we're making tweaks to really advance cover cropping as a better weed suppression tool. And so that's what I'm going to share today, are some things that we've learned for doing that, okay? And so what are the goals if that's the case? If we're already set and we're cover cropping and we want to do more with cover crops, what are the goals for really thinking about how we can use cover crops as a tool in our integrated weed management toolbox? And here I'm thinking about conventional no-till systems where the standard weed control program is probably a 2-pass herbicide program with pre's up front and a post-emergence pass to clean up, or perhaps with some additional residuals in that post program. And so I have 3 goals that I've been trying to focus on as far as how we can make cover crops part of this integrated weed management system. One, we want to use cover crops to reduce early season weed recruitment and growth rates, okay? So we want to drive down the emerged population in those soybean or corn crops when we're coming in with our additional post-pass or additional weed control tool. The other thing that I have been spending time thinking about and trying to demonstrate is that the use of cover crops in these no-till systems can provide a lot of benefits when it comes to staying on target. And what I mean by staying on target is that the goal is we need to spray weeds when they're at about the 4-inch stage to remain effective, okay? And oftentimes we have a very narrow window to do that, all right? And so when we integrate cover crops into the system, sometimes we can lengthen the period in which we can stay on target and stay on schedule, okay? And I think that's a really important part of an integrated weed management system. And then finally, can we use cover crops if we really, think about optimizing and achieving greater levels of biomass or performance? Can we reduce some herbicide inputs? Can we either maintain our crop protection goal, or in the case of palmer or water hemp, a 0 seed rain management goal, while still being able to eliminate either a pass or an active ingredient in the system because we're getting that much weed control from cover crops? So those are the goals that I'm mostly focusing on in my research. And I'm going to talk about kind of the use of high residue surface mulch, but given that you guys struggle much like Pennsylvania does with mare's tail control, I want to spend a little bit of time first talking about our research on that. And so In Pennsylvania, in our no-till systems, mare's tail is probably our #1 weed issue. It's the most widespread across the state. We have water hemp and palmer. They've been introduced in the state since about 2012. I wouldn't describe Pennsylvania at epidemic levels yet, but they continue to increase across the state. And so those are probably our 3 biggest resistant weed issues. We struggle with other weeds like burr cucumber as well. And so what our work has shown, and I think what a lot of growers have found, is that integrating fall sown cover crops really takes an unmanageable weed problem in mare's tail and makes it much more manageable, okay? And I'm gonna just talk about why that is and some of the management practices that are helpful as far as making that happen. And so really what we're trying to avoid, and what I spend a lot of time talking to growers about, is that this is a recipe for failure. And I'm sure you all realize this as well, is if the first time you try to manage those fall emerging horseweed plants is at planting with a pre-plant burn down herbicide, and they've already bolted and have put on this much growth, we're going to struggle regardless of the herbicide technologies that we have available to us. Right now, with the introduction of Enlist and Extend technologies, we can still maybe knock down some big mare's tail plants, but we shouldn't expect to be able to do that long term, okay? It's just generally a bad approach. And so we also need to start clean because it's just very problematic to control mare's tail post-emergence in soybeans. I do want to note that, I heard Kevin mention this in the last talk, that we can't really characterize mare's tail anymore as a winter annual species. And so it's mare's tail doesn't have an after ripening requirement, and so it germinates when conditions are suitable. And so in Pennsylvania, traditionally, we saw a lot more emergence happening in the fall and maybe some spring emergence. But in more recent years and in different parts of the state, we're seeing more and more mare's tail recruitment in crop, okay? And so the research I'm going to talk about has really focused on managing those fall emerging plants to make sure that we can start clean. The control strategies for managing mare's tail in crop, or for those plants that are emerging in crop, I'm not going to address. So this is some research that was done a number of years ago now, but what we really wanted to look at was the right approach as far as species selection and management of fall sown cover crops for really maximizing mare's tail suppression in the fall and the spring. And so we screen a number of different cover crops, and I want to mention that I'm characterizing this as a longer cover cropping growing season window. And so with corn silage acres in Pennsylvania, or wheat acres where we don't have a double crop soybean behind it, we have a longer fall cover crop growing season window where we might be able to get those cover crops out from the middle of September into early October. And that's a very different window and a very different management scenario than coming in after corn harvested for grain or soybeans, where we're really pushed into late October typically, or early November. Okay, and so because we are in that longer window, we were able to look at kind of a more diverse set of cover crop species, including some winter kill mixes, because some growers are interested in using those winter kill cover crops to get that fall benefit, but then not have to deal with killing that cover crop in the spring. And so what our data shown is there's a number of ways in which we can get fairly high levels of mare's tail weed suppression. And so this data is really just measuring the population or the density of mare's tail plants in these treatments at the time of a pre-plant burn down in the middle of May or early May relative to a fallow control, okay? And so anything that had rye in it, we saw greater than 70% weed suppression potential, or control of those fall emerging mare's tail plants. And we did a little bit of modeling work, and so we followed some kind of demographics and characteristics of those cover crop species, and what we found was that the suppression level, whether we were down here at 50% compared to 90% suppression, was really driven by how quickly those cover crops established and got to a pretty good ground cover in the fall, as well as fall and spring biomass potential. So it's just not biomass in this case, it's also ground cover that's a predictor of weed suppression potential. And the performance of the cover crop, and really so the ground cover and the biomass that we achieve are really driven by sowing date, species selection, and soil fertility, okay? So this just kind of illustrates that. So on the bottom panel, what we did was we just, we put on 40 units of N at planting, and so we just wanted to kind of simulate conditions in higher fertility systems in Pennsylvania that are using a lot of manures, where there might be some fall nitrogen that could be scavenged by these cover crops in comparison to a lower fertility system. And you can see just 3 treatments that I'm characterizing here: oats, cereal rye in monocultures, or the cereal rye tillage radish mix, where we decreased the seeding rate of radish or rye when we included the radish. And so the oats, as far as fall biomass production, were really the highest biomass producing treatments, but you can see there's a difference in species as far as ground cover potential. And so the greater tillering capacity of cereal rye ended up having greater ground cover, and we were able to achieve similar levels of ground cover using a mixture, using a lower seeding rate when we were in a higher fertility condition. So radish is a really good nitrogen scavenger and has some benefit when it comes to weed suppression in the fall under those scenarios. The other thing that we focused on as far as thinking about kind of cover crops as an integrated weed management tool was not just the density of plants or the size of that population that we were controlling with cover crops, but the distribution of the sizes of individual plants that we were dealing with. And so we did some tracking of those fall emerging rosettes. And the idea generally here is that we want to stay on target with our fall or with our spring pre-plant burn down applications. And in the absence of competition, we're more likely to see either larger rosettes that emerged in the fall or taller bolted plants in the spring. And so we had this hypothesis that in the absence of a cover crop and a fallow condition, we have a lot of variability as far as resources available at a field scale. We would have a lot of variation in emergence timing in that fallow system as far as mare's tail. And we would end up with this condition where we had both small mare's tail plants in the field as well as large rosettes or bolted plants. And that by introducing competition through cover crops, we would be constraining that population to individuals that were similar sizes and hopefully smaller, all right? Because we would potentially be eliminating the variation in emergence, and we would be eliminating kind of differences in resource availability, right? So we'd be dealing with smaller plants, which should lead to greater herbicide efficacy with our pre-plant burn down applications. And this is generally what we found in the data. So this is just looking at the cereal rye treatment, 2 bushels per acre compared to the winter fallow. Here on the x-axis is the distribution of rosette sizes in those populations, okay? And so you can see in the winter fallow, we had some big rosettes out here, and those are going to be the ones that are more challenging to control depending on herbicide selection and rate, okay? Whereas in the cereal rye treatment, we really eliminated those large individuals due to introducing that competition. We've subsequently, in more recent years, looked at that kind of later planting window, so after a corn crop or soybeans, where you're out there in the last half of October or maybe early November. And, based on the literature and based on research done as far as the value of seeding rates for small grains that you're taking as a cash crop, that research suggests that there's a benefit to higher seeding rates as far as increasing weed suppression potential. And so we were kind of following on that idea and asking whether we are getting some more benefit at higher seeding rates from mare's tail control. And that's not what we found. We found that we saw similar levels of mare's tail suppression between 45 pounds to 120 pounds. And so why is that? My best educated guess is that the value of increasing seeding rates is when you have more plants in that row, when weeds are emerging, you see a benefit of weed suppression, right? So if you have weeds emerging with that crop, you have more crop plants in that row, you're going to see better weed suppression potential. If you're seeding late enough where you're seeding into conditions in which you're clean or you don't have a lot of mare's tail pressure, and that mare's tail pressure is coming later, because of the kind of tillering capacity of cereal rye, we start to see things even out as far as ground cover and biomass production, okay? So this is a positive thing. This means that we can go from a $30+ kind of seeding rate down to more of a $12 to $15 seeding rate and still be successful as far as meeting our weed suppression goal. One thing I want to note, and I don't have great data on this because it's really hard. You have to be able to track kind of weeds pre-spray and after spray, which is tough to do in a cover crop. But based on some other studies, when the interest is delaying cereal rye termination, and I'll get into kind of planting green scenarios and that kind of thing, and we're thinking about delaying cereal rye termination until rye gets into the heading stage, then spray coverage becomes an issue, all right? And so if you have mare's tail recruitment going on in that cover crop, you're likely suppressing its growth, and it's down there in the canopy, surviving. And if you let that cover crop go, and now you're getting the pre-plant burn down and the cereal rye termination in the same pass, there's potential for some spray coverage issue, which we've seen in some of our work, and so you can get some mare's tail escapes. And so what we suggest is to think about potentially combining kind of this, two-pass fall, or early spring burn down, followed by a pre-plant burn down application. In a cereal rye cover crop, you can use 2,4-D to selectively control mare's tail if needed. And so we had some trials for a few years looking at that scenario where we just sowed a rye cover crop after harvesting soybeans. And then we came back in early April and looked at some selective treatments. And what really came out of that work, we tried a couple different things, but the big takeaway is that we still need a good rate of 2,4-D to get good control. We can't cut that rate and go back to a pint and still be effective. So some takeaways as far as just thinking about using cover crops as a good integrated weed management tool for mare's tail management. I think there's this great potential, and I think it's being borne out by some growers that have adopted this, that you can really reduce the need for this kind of two-pass burn down program that's often needed to manage mare's tail. These really significant population decreases, again, there's, it's not complete, it's not 100%. We've heard this said a few times today, but significant reduction, 70 or 80% reduction in the emerged population means that the cover crops are doing a significant portion of that work, and that there's fewer genotypes out there when we're applying these pre-plant burn down herbicides, all right? And so effectively what we're doing is kind of lowering selection for resistance evolution, and that's going to be really important as we continue to use those auxin herbicides in these soybean traded systems as our primary burn down tool for horseweed or sharpen-based programs, okay? Okay, so I want to transition and talk a little bit about our work on planting green. I started out mentioning, what is the cover cropping goal, the ecosystem services that you're potentially getting from cover crops. Some are related to biomass production, all right? And so we have growers in our state that are realizing the weed suppression benefit from delaying cover crop termination, but really their goal is soil health driven, and they're interested in this practice, and they're also interested in this practice as a way to manage spring conditions, particularly wet springs. And so I've been doing several projects related to this practice as it kind of continues to pick up speed and adoption in our state. And so, again, the goals are essentially the same as the mare's tail goals that I covered, right? And so we're thinking about now using higher biomass cover crops and that surface mulch as a way to stay on target with post applications in a 2-pass herbicide program. The goal is to really reduce early season recruitment of summer annuals, all right? And so weed control is population density dependent, right? We get better control levels. There'll be fewer escapes and fewer individuals out in the field if we're spraying populations that are smaller, all right? So cover crops can do some of that work. And then there's this potential to reduce herbicide inputs depending on what your management goal is, what your system is, likely what type of species you're dealing with. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple studies. One, there's, most of the work to date that has been done is focused on soybeans as far as planting green, cereal rye into soybeans. I'm part of a multi-region project, which includes Ohio, looking at planting green and the IPM implications when we're doing this in field corn. And so we're still using cereal rye as the cover crop ahead of corn, but there's plant disease data being taken, insect pest data being taken, as well as weed suppression data as well. And so, one thing that's already been discussed a little bit today is this idea of what the target should be for how much biomass I need and what is the benefit from a weed suppression standpoint. And really, should we be targeting a threshold or not? And so that's a tough question to answer, and I'm not necessarily a proponent of thinking about threshold targets for biomass production. But we have been able to utilize the data that has come out of this project to start to answer some of those questions. And so what you're looking at is 3 years from Pennsylvania. And so we have the cereal rye biomass that was achieved by delaying termination across a couple different dates. And this is the weed suppression relative to the fallow control. And where I'm just focusing on weed density of broadleaf species. And so in this study, those broadleafs were primarily redroot pigweed, common ragweed, lamb's quarters, and mare's tail as well. And so we don't have water hemp or palmer in this particular study. So this is total broadleaf density at the time of a post-emergence application in corn, so about the V4 to V5 stage. And so if you look at the data, what it shows is, well, we can ask, where do we get 80% suppression or a decrease in the population by 80% at that time of post-emergence application? And what is the threshold biomass that achieves that? And so 5,000 pounds per acre was the number that this data came up with. And so I think that's notable. I also, as a scientist, am more interested in these points than that general trend. So we still see high levels of weed suppression at lower biomass in some cases, and we also see weed escapes in high biomass cases as well. And so to make this a more consistent approach, we need to understand what those factors are that are contributing to that variability, okay? But the other thing that this work shows is the importance of delaying termination to get to that 80% threshold. So I'm not sure you can see the background data, but what this shows is that that 80% threshold, we're consistently achieving it when we're delaying termination to at or after planting, all right? So delaying termination and gaining those additional growing degree days for 2 to 3 weeks is all we need in Pennsylvania to get to those biomass thresholds where we get meaningful levels of suppression. So this is I want to reemphasize again, I have some grass data I'm not showing. That number is different for grasses. So it's not as effective on grasses. We don't achieve 80% control of annual grasses with 5,000 pounds of dry matter biomass. So this is very specific to small seeded broadleaf annual species. And so I'm emphasizing that because we start to think about the mechanisms that influence weed suppression potential and how that relates to biomass. And so I talked about biomass, these indirect effects that occur in that soil surface where weeds are germinating. We're drier, we're colder, there's less light penetration getting into the canopy, and that can delay emergence of species to later due to those indirect effects. The other thing that can go on is that these species germinate in those conditions and don't survive to seedling establishment. And so we call this, well, basically what we're trying to do is get greater seedling mortality from that surface mulch. And that's a function of kind of the physical interference from the mulch. And there's more physical interference, the larger biomass we can produce. And then also it's a function of species, because smaller seeded species, we're going to have resource exhaustion happen sooner than larger seeded species, right? So larger seeded species have greater reserves in their seeds, and they're able to grow through much more biomass. And so a grad student, Tila Fix, who just graduated here a year or so ago, and she did this really cool greenhouse study where she created a surface mulch gradient with cereal rye. And then she looked at a range of seed size and different functional traits and measured their seedling survival. And so these are the larger seeded species. You can see Burke cucumber blows right through 10,000 pounds of dry matter biomass. Whereas we start to deal with smaller seeded species, common ragweed, Palmer amaranth, we start to see seedling survival decrease at surface mulch conditions in which we can achieve, 3,000 to 5,000 pounds of dry matter biomass. So this is significant because what we want to do is really draw down that weed seed bank rather than push the weed seed bank problem down the road. This is more data from Tila's work, and the other neat thing that she found from this work is that she didn't just measure the seedling survival. The seedlings that survived, she broke out, she collected all the biomass, roots and shoots, and then measured the differences in resource allocation patterns of those species. Okay, and so what her data shows is that as we get to the smaller seeded species like common ragweed and velvet leaf, which is kind of not really a small seeded species, we see greater resource allocation going to hypocotyl elongation in order to get through that mulch, all right? And that comes at a cost, all right? So this velvet leaf plant that had to grow through very high levels of surface mulch spent a lot of resources on that hypocotyl in order to get some true leaves out there that could photosynthesize, and it came at a pretty significant cost to root production, okay? So even when we're not completely controlling these weeds, we're altering resource allocation patterns, we're altering their growth patterns early in the season, which I think probably means that they're more susceptible to other additional control tactics, whether it's a post-emergence herbicide or a cultivation pass. So I think this is some neat work that we're interested in continuing to look at. Okay, I want to end by talking about the trade-offs and overcoming the trade-offs to get to higher levels of biomass. And so I really think that to make this work, we need to think about using this as an adaptive management approach. How much time do I have? I see you jumping up. Okay. Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we've been looking at a number of different kind of management implications beyond kind of the weed management story with planting green. And I think that one of the greatest challenges to making this practice work consistently is figuring out how to manage soil moisture conditions. And so we have growers in our state that are actually thinking about using this as a tool to manage soil moisture conditions. In wet springs, they allow that cover crop to continue to grow and pull soil moisture out, and they're able to get to good field fit conditions to plant into sooner, or at least on time, in wet springs. But we can also potentially have dry springs or we can become dry after planting, right? And so the longer we allow cereal rye to grow, the more moisture it's removing from the soil moisture profile. Typically, most of the measurements that occur are in that 3-inch to maybe 6-inch zone that they're measuring soil moisture conditions. And so we had a couple experiments going for 3 years at the Penn State Research Farm. What the data you're looking at is soil volumetric water content at a 3-inch depth. And this is the planting green treatment relative to the standard treatment where we were terminating cereal rye about 3 weeks prior to planting. And so anywhere where the bars and points are below the blue line indicates that we are drier in the planting green treatment relative to standard termination tactics, okay? In general, what we think we would likely see is that we are drier early in the season or at planting because that cereal rye continues to grow and remove soil moisture. But later in the season, we potentially have a soil moisture conservation benefit because we have less evaporative loss due to that surface mulch being present, okay? And so that work showed that we saw this pattern, we saw some of those patterns, but not consistently across years. And the 1 year in which we saw, prolonged or sustained conditions in which we were drier in the planting green treatment relative to the standard treatment were the years that we saw a yield drag, okay? And so in 1 out of 3 years, we saw a yield drag in the planting green treatment compared to standard termination tactics. We've done a fair amount of this work. I would say that, pretty consistently we have yields in soybeans that we yield pretty similarly when we're planting green relative to standard termination. But under the right circumstances, in drier years, when the soil moisture dynamics don't play out right, there's this potential for a yield penalty, okay? I'll also note that I think that's a more dramatic effect would be had in corn due to that. I also get each spring a fair number of questions, or at least a call or two, about not completely getting the cover crop killed. And I'm highlighting this now without going into a lot of detail because this also kind of influences the soil moisture dynamics, right? So depending on our product of choice and depending on the environmental conditions, we may not see that cover crop get completely killed for several weeks. And if that means that the cover crop continues to pull soil moisture out, we're influencing those soil moisture dynamics. And often the culprit is, at least in corn or in soybeans where metribuzin is being used, is that when glyphosate is the product of choice as the termination tool, there's potential for tank mix antagonism. When we use atrazine before corn or metribuzin before soybeans, and I'm not sure if you can see this really well from the back, but in general, you can see that we stay green much longer when we have atrazine in the tank with glyphosate. And so these pictures at 14 days would look very similar. We eventually kill that cover crop with all the glyphosate-based treatments, including the atrazine treatment, and they end up looking better as far as termination efficacy relative to gramoxone-based treatments, but it takes longer. And in cool, wet springs, that can be exacerbated. Another management trade-off that we've been focusing on, which also has kind of weed management implications, is managing these higher levels of residue when it comes to crop establishment, and this has an impact on weed recruitment. And so this is just our little 4-row planter, and I only include a picture of this to suggest that I think if we're going to make planting green work as a practice, we have to think about it as an adaptive management practice, and we have to have a number of tools available to make sure that we can get consistent crop establishment, all right? A big part for us as far as getting more consistent stands into higher residue cover crops has been our transition to the Delta Force system, where previously we were just running airbags, and so that has really been a big game changer as far as getting a consistent stand and an even stand and getting that seed placed in the furrow correctly. Another thing is that we've tried a number of different roller crimpers, and I'm going to talk about that as a weed suppression tool here, but we either run kind of an I&J style crimper in front of the planter or this integrated ZRX roller crimper. And when we do that, we're typically using this double disc row cleaner ahead of the crimper. And so row cleaning is important as well as far as getting consistent stands, and it also has an important implication for weed pressure. And so we did a couple studies, 2 years at the research station, and then also some on-farm trials that had similar treatments in Pennsylvania, where we looked at planting green scenarios where we had different kind of residue management strategies. So we either roll crimped or planted corn into standing cereal rye. And we had 2 treatments where we roll crimped, one where we didn't employ row cleaners, so we were using the I&J style roller crimper, and one where we are using roll crimpers in combination with row cleaners. We also had a couple treatments, just as our standard was really just the pre-plant 2 to 3 week prior to termination burn down. There's a considerable amount of double cropping acres in Pennsylvania as far as ryeage, followed by corn silage, where they'd be harvesting that rye. So we had a treatment to simulate that as well. A number of things came out of that study, but I just want to highlight the weed suppression dynamic story here. And so this data is from 2020. We did it in 2 years. The second year was a little bit messier, so I'm just highlighting this particular year. And so I want to focus you in on these boxes, which are the planting green treatments. So we're planting green into standing rye residue, planting green into roll crimped with no row cleaning, or planting green into roll crimped rye with row cleaners, okay? And now we're coming back and we're measuring both between row weed pressure and in row weed pressure at about the V3 to V4 growth stage. And so you can see the difference. When we're row cleaning, we're increasing the amount of in-row weed recruitment that we're getting. We're essentially doubling the amount of weed pressure in row by creating that disturbance, and perhaps a necessary disturbance in order to get those good stands. But we're increasing weed pressure. Again, we're doing this in the absence of residuals, so we can measure just the effect of this residue management strategy. The other thing that we found was that when we're planting into standing residue, we end up having better in-row weed control, but higher between-row weed pressure in comparison to roll crimping, okay? And so there's these trade-offs depending on residue management strategies when it comes to weed recruitment and weed suppression potential. We had a split plot in there that included a residual versus no residual, and essentially the take-home is that that residual is really important, and particularly in corn, where we don't want a lot of early season weed competition in the rows. So having that residual banded over the row or broadcast and having it over the row is important for staying clean. Okay, the last trade-off that we're spending a lot of time thinking about is this interaction and potential kind of negative interaction between planting green and using higher levels of rye biomass and residual herbicide efficacy. And so this is a USDA-funded study that I'm leading with a couple weed scientists in the Mid-Atlantic. And we have these joint trials out where we're essentially creating a lot of conditions in order to spray residual herbicides into. Planting green scenarios where we're roll crimping versus standing. We're killing cereal rye at different stages in order to create different biomass conditions. And we have a couple, we have a couple legume versus legume grass mixtures versus monoculture comparisons. And essentially what we're trying to do is to understand if there's a particular set of residue management conditions that really optimize deposition and bioavailability of soil applied herbicides. And so We have 1 full year across the locations completed, and we're going to do this again next year. And so what we're doing with this particular study is trying to understand the herbicide fate, right? So how we manage that cover crop, how much is there, whether it's roll crimped or standing, influences the deposition of that herbicide, how much is getting to the soil surface, and then a fraction is going to be intercepted. In a planting green scenario, some of it may be absorbed into the plant and lost, metabolized and lost to weed control. If it's dead, or perhaps if it's green, we'll have some wash off of that herbicide back onto the soil surface. And we're trying to measure both the deposition and the wash off pattern. So we're doing this with kind of a soil Petri assay type of approach, where we place these dishes with field soil before we apply the herbicide. We come in immediately after, or a few hours after we collect it. We replace it with a fresh set and wait for that incorporating rainfall event. And so that's measuring how much is coming off as wash off. We're taking some demographic and biomass data to correlate those patterns to the residue. And then we're analyzing those soil samples for herbicide concentrations in the soil. We're using Zidua or peroxysulfone as our test species or test herbicide for this. So the takeaways from the first year of data is that, as you might expect, delaying termination influences the amount of deposition plus wash off, okay? And so from the flag leaf to heading stage, we're basically intercepting from a quarter to half of that herbicide that was applied. When we allow cereal rye to go to anthesis, we're intercepting from 2/3 to 3/4 of that herbicide, okay? The other takeaway was that as far as how much and how important that incorporating rainfall is as far as getting that wash off, it's more important, there's a greater fraction that's coming off as wash off when we're roll crimping compared to allowing that cover crop to stand, and when we're using a rye legume mixture, which I attribute to the fact that there's just more surface area for interception to occur, okay? I don't know if I mentioned this, but we did this assay twice. We either did it in that planting green scenario where we were applying that herbicide when we're killing the cover crop versus kind of an early post-emergence kind of scenario where we're killing the cover crop and then coming back and applying that residual. And so that could either be, an overlapping residual type program in soybeans, or it could be just positioning your pre's in corn in that early post window. And so what we found was that we're essentially doubling the amount of deposition or herbicide bioavailability by delaying that application until that early post-emergence period relative to planting green. Okay, just a couple more notes. We have a complementary field experiment at each one of those locations that's part of this project that is trying to get at, well, does this matter at all, right? So I've just told you that there's significant interference going on when it comes to deposition of the herbicide and it getting through the soil profile through those cover crops. And so we have an experiment where we're looking at either water hemp in Pennsylvania or Palmer amaranth in Virginia and Delaware, where we're applying peroxysulfone at a number of different timings in 2 different planting green scenarios, one where we're planting green early into lower levels of biomass and another later at anthesis relative to a standard termination timing. The takeaway from this work after 3 site years is that it's more important to think about applying that residual relative to the first flush of Palmer amaranth or water hemp that you're going to get. So even though we're measuring a lot of interference, we're still seeing more value in positioning the residual just before emergence. And so in our case in Pennsylvania, that was applying herbicides kind of at that anthesis stage because we hadn't seen water hemp emerge up until that point. We do find that planting green has a benefit from kind of an integrated weed management standpoint, and that it's reducing the potential for larger weed escapes or 4-inch weeds when we want to come in and apply post-emergence herbicide, and that's from plots where we have a residual control. We're just looking at the residue effect on recruitment timing and growth rates of those species. That work also has demonstrated that really if the zero seed rain is the management goal, and Alyssa touched on this before, this overlapping residual program, or at least that having that residual applied post-emergence, a group 15, is going to be really important for staying clean because of the longer emergence patterns of those species. There's really great work going on as part of the U.S. Soybean Board. Rodrigo, you can't see this here, but this is work that's being led by Rodrigo Worley at the University of Wisconsin and his PhD student, Jose Nunez. And this is a project that I'm involved in with these guys, as well as Kansas and Illinois. So this was done at 4 locations for 2 different years. So this is based on 6 site years. And it's taking a similar approach to what we were doing and what I just described. We're trying to measure the interference potential of planting green or higher residue cover crops as far as soil bioavailability of these pre-herbicides. And so that work follows pyroxasulfone as well as flumioxazin, and I'm just showing the pyroxasulfone data. And what this story kind of adds beyond what I just told you was that this followed, we took soil samples, and so we were looking at the herbicide concentration for a 3-week period in this study. And so you can see pyroxasulfone concentration in the soil in the no-till treatment without cover crops at 0 days through 21 days. This figure shows you that same pattern when we're terminating rye early versus planting green. And so the takeaway here is that they're seeing similar levels of interference, so we're decreasing the concentration of that herbicide in the soil by having that cover crop out there by 2/3 to 3/4. And we're not getting it back, is the story. We're getting a little bit of a bump when we're spraying into brown or dead material, right? So we can see this kind of wash-off pattern in the data here, where at 7 days we're at a higher concentration than when we sampled it at 0 days. But in the planting green treatment, really not much of a bump at all. And again, the take-home with their data, which is similar to our data, is that we still see this benefit of using higher residue cover crops and planting green and combining them with residuals at that pre-emergence timing, all right? And so, again, 3/4 of that herbicide is not getting down to the soil profile, but we're still seeing really high levels of weed control when we combine those tactics. And the question is why? My thinking is that we have a lot of interference occurring where we have really good mulch conditions, right? And in that scenario, that mulch is providing probably most of the weed control. But even if you have 5,000 pounds of dry matter biomass in the surface, there's going to be some gaps, right? There's going to be some gaps in the row. There's just how that residue lays down. There's going to be some weak spots. And those weak spots, we're not getting that herbicide interference. We're getting a full deposition of the residual herbicide in those gaps, okay? So it's kind of this spatial dynamic that occurs both at a very small scale, but probably also at a field scale, right? Your cover crop's going to be weak in certain areas of your field. And so there's going to be this benefit of having that cover crop out there for multiple benefits, including weed suppression potential, but that residual is needed to kind of even out weed suppression in those gaps. Okay, so just to wrap up, as far as integrated weed management and planting green, I think the benefits are there. It's a tool for staying on schedule. We can reduce early season recruitment, and sometimes pretty significantly. There's trade-offs that we need to figure out how to overcome and manage, all right? And so that includes thinking about termination timing in spring relative to soil moisture conditions. It includes thinking about planter setup and termination efficacy. And it also probably requires integrating good foundational residual herbicide programs as well. And so this is really what I think of thinking about cover crops as the foundation for integrated weed management, I think of it as a proactive resistance management tool. Everything I told you today about reducing recruitment rates has a long-term benefit when it comes to resistance evolution, right? We're reducing the number of genotypes that are exposed to selection when cover crops do half or more of the work, all right? And when we stay on target and spray small weeds, we're limiting survival of genotypes that may have resistant alleles. And when we're able to pull some herbicide inputs out of the program, we're reducing the frequency of selection events for resistance, okay? So I think I want to leave that and kind of end there, because to me that's the real benefit of integrating cover crops from a weed management perspective, is that we can potentially use these cover crops for multiple benefits, and one of them is stewarding effective sites of action that we still have. All right, thank you. Hopefully I have time for a question or two.
Do you have time for questions? Any other questions?
John. Yeah, so the question was about, what about bumping rates up, if able, to overcome that? Is that your question? Yeah, I wouldn't recommend bumping rates up, because I think that it's really a deposition issue, right? And the rate's not going to matter that much. That just means that if you're spraying at a higher rate, you know, whatever's being intercepted, it's going to be the equivalent interception rate, right? You'll have a higher rate, and initial concentration will be higher in the soil as far as the amount that gets through. But to the extent that that's going to work itself out to where you have better coverage in the soil, I don't think that's going to be the case. Yeah, well, I mean, so that's the question. I think we need more data, but I will say that based on our work and work of others, I think we're all coming to the same conclusion, that there's still value for integrating both the cover crop and the higher residue and the residual, regardless of these interception dynamics that we continue to measure, because we don't see the effect in weed control levels, right? We either see similar levels or greater levels of control when the tactics are combined, right? If there's really something going on, we would expect to see a signal in the weed pressure, and we're not seeing that. I'll add one more caveat, that the concern, which we definitely don't have an answer for, and which there's much discussion about, is that there's some work that suggests that one of the ways in which we increase the rate of resistance evolution is by subjecting weed populations to sublethal rates over and over. It's one of the reasons why we don't recommend applying cut rates of herbicides, right? And so to the extent that we might be contributing to that factor down the road, I think is a potential risk, and is something that we need to learn more about, because that's a potential drawback of these interception rates that we're measuring.
Can you recap your thoughts on crimping or not crimping crop?
Sure. Okay, so yeah, this comes up. So you know, a lot of growers in Pennsylvania plant. My start with crimping was high biomass cover crops, organic rotational no-till practices. And so as I started to work on this tactic in conventional systems, my thought was, well, we're always going to roll the cover crop, right? But you can be planting green into boot stage rye or early heading rye where there's really not any benefit in roll crimping. So in order to get, because I think it bounces back up when it's that low for the most part. You don't really create the surface mulch that you're trying to achieve with the roller crimper. So as it gets into the heading stage or late heading stage, I think that there's a benefit to rolling, particularly in corn. Some of the data I didn't show you is that corn does not like to emerge into green cover or standing residue, right? So it's a lot more sensitive to light quality differences. And we consistently see this etiolation effect in corn when it emerges into standing cover. And it hasn't always resulted in a yield drag, but I think under certain sets of conditions it would. So I think that there's a benefit to rolling ahead of corn because of that. We see soybeans are a much more plastic crop. They can respond to lower densities, and they don't seem to mind we still see a little bit of an etiolation effect, but it's not as dramatic. I still think that there's a benefit to roller crimping